Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to sit with you a while in the quiet of this hour. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you tonight? Perhaps the soft scratch of rain against the glass, a cup grown gently cool, a room settled into its evening stillness. These are the hours when Watson's pen moved most honestly, when ink met paper not in haste, but in the unhurried spirit of reflection. Tonight, he brings us a case where the truth was hidden not in shadow but in plain sight, dressed in the respectable clothing of assumption. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins so that no detail escapes you. Now make yourself comfortable, for as Holmes well understood, it is not the obvious that deceives us. It is the unquestioned. You'll find our Spotify channel, Watson's Margins, linked in the description below. We are glad you're here. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Record. It was during the latter days of a particularly sullen November that the affair I have chosen to call the case of the missing court transcript first made itself known to us at Baker Street. I had called upon Holmes that afternoon with no especial purpose, having found my own rooms oppressive in the early dusk, and was settling into my customary chair with a copy of the British Medical Journal when the bell below announced a visitor. Holmes, who had been reclining upon the sofa in a state of chemical-scented abstraction, raised his head with the sudden alertness of a hound that catches a scent upon the wind. "A professional man," said he, before Mrs. Hudson had ascended half the stair. "He climbs with decision but pauses upon the landing, a man unaccustomed to asking for help." I had long since abandoned the habit of disputing such preliminary observations, and so I merely set aside my journal and prepared to observe. The man who entered was perhaps 50 years of age, lean and upright in the manner of one who has spent a lifetime in the courts, where bearing carries its own authority. His dark coat was well cut, though worn at the cuffs in a manner suggesting old money applied to professional necessity rather than personal vanity. His face was sharp-featured, carrying the habitual gravity of a senior barrister. Yet I noticed at once the agitation working beneath that controlled exterior, the slight compression of the lips, the restlessness of fingers that could not altogether be stilled. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "my name is Percival Armitage. I'm a barrister of some 25 years' standing, and I find myself in a position which, I confess, I do not entirely know how to characterize." Holmes gestured toward the basket chair. "Pray sit down, Mr. Armitage, and tell me when you last slept." The man blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You have the look of a man who retired late and rose before dawn. The matter is evidently urgent. Do proceed." Armitage seated himself, drew a slow breath, and began. He was, he explained, lead counsel for the prosecution in Regina versus Holloway, a complex fraud case involving the alleged manipulation of railway investment accounts. The trial had been proceeding for 3 weeks, and the prosecution's position, while not unassailable, had been strengthened considerably by a particular piece of testimony, that of one Frederick Crane, an accountant who had given detailed evidence of altered ledger entries. That testimony had been transcribed in full, certified, and lodged in Armitage's chambers for review before its formal submission to the court record. The previous morning it was gone. "The chambers were locked," said Armitage, leaning forward with an intensity that communicated both distress and professional embarrassment. "The transcript was secured in the lower left-hand drawer of my writing desk, a drawer which admits of only one key, and that key remains at all times upon my person. I left the chambers at 7:30 in the evening. My clerk, young Lyle, had already departed. When I returned at 8 o'clock the following morning, the drawer was locked as I had left it, and yet the transcript was absent." "And nothing else was disturbed?" Holmes asked. "Nothing. No other document, no item of value. Only the transcript." Holmes pressed his fingertips together in that cathedral arch I knew well. "You mentioned a clerk. Edwin Lyle, I presume. You have spoken his name once already, with a hesitation that suggests complicated feeling." Armitage's expression tightened perceptibly. "Lyle has been in my employ for 3 years. He is a capable young man, but there has been Friction. I was obliged last month to reprimand him formally over an error of procedure, and a promotion which he had anticipated was subsequently withheld. I am not, Mr. Holmes, a man who makes accusations lightly. But I cannot in honesty exclude the possibility. Has Lyle been made aware of his position as a suspect? Inspector Lestrade is already of the opinion that the matter is straightforward. He interviewed Lyle this morning. I glanced at Holmes. The name of Lestrade invariably produced in him a particular quality of attention, a readiness not so much for cooperation as for independent inquiry. "Tell me," said Holmes, rising abruptly and moving to the window, where he stood looking down upon Baker Street with his hands clasped behind his back, "was the Transcript's content known more widely than your own chambers?" Armitage paused. It was not a secret document precisely. The testimony had been given in open court. The certified transcript, however, contained annotations and cross-references prepared by my office, material that had not been made public, and the significance of the transcript to the case as a whole. Without it, the prosecution faces a serious difficulty. Crane's testimony, as delivered verbally, was challenged at several points. The transcript, properly certified, would silence those challenges. Holmes turned from the window. His grey eyes were bright with that particular lucidity which I had come to associate over the years with the opening of a case that genuinely engaged him. When Holmes was bored, the world contracted to the narrow compass of Baker Street and whatever chemical experiment he had in progress. When he was engaged, the whole of London seemed to sharpen around him. "Watson," said he, "your coat is already on. Mr. Armitage, if you will permit it, I should like to examine your chambers before the afternoon light fails entirely. There is much that a room conceals, and rather more that it is willing to reveal to a careful observer." Armitage rose with visible relief. "I had hoped you would say as much, Mr. Holmes." We took a cab through the thickening fog of the November afternoon, the gas lamps already beginning to assert themselves against the early dark. Armitage's chambers were situated in one of those sober stone-fronted buildings near the Inns of Court that exude the particular gravity of the legal profession, a gravity compounded of precedent, responsibility, and the quiet awareness that careers and liberties alike are decided within their walls. As we mounted the stairs, Lee Armitage explained that Lestrade had already conducted a preliminary inspection, though Holmes received this intelligence with the expression of a man learning that a sensitive object has been handled without gloves. The chambers themselves were orderly, high-ceilinged, and lined on 3 walls with volumes of law, their spines uniformly sober. The writing desk stood beneath the principal window, a substantial piece of Victorian craftsmanship, with a leather surface and a row of drawers down each pedestal. Armitage indicated the lower left-hand drawer, which had been relocked following Lestrade's inspection. Holmes knelt at once before it, produced his glass, and examined the lock and its surrounding wood with meticulous patience. He then scrutinized the desk's surface, the carpet beneath, and the window frame, and moving with that noiseless economy of motion which I had always found remarkable in a man of his height and angular build. I stood to one side and watched, as I had watched so many times before, and felt again the familiar mixture of admiration and bafflement that Holmes invariably produced in me. To the untrained eye, he appeared to be doing very little. I knew from long experience that he was doing a great deal. "Interesting," he murmured at last, that single word which, upon his lips, was never an idle filler but always a precise report. "You have found something?" asked Armitage. Holmes straightened and returned the glass to his pocket. "I have found several things," said he, "and the absence of several others. The 2 categories are, in this instance, equally instructive." He said nothing further upon the matter that evening, but as we descended to the street and parted from Armitage with an assurance of Holmes's continued attention, I observed that the abstraction which had clouded him all day had entirely dissolved. He walked with his chin lifted and his eyes alert, already, I suspected, several steps ahead of the case, as Lestrade had thus far conceived it. The game, as Holmes himself would have said, was afoot. Chapter 2. the clerk's guilt. The following morning broke cold and clear, one of those rare November days when the London fog relents, and the city appears almost honest in the thin winter light. I arrived at Baker Street shortly after 9 to find Holmes already dressed, standing at the breakfast table with a cup of tea growing cold beside him, and a sheaf of papers in his hand. He had evidently been occupied since early hours, for the papers were marked with his cramped annotations, and the tobacco ash in the grate was considerable. "Lestrade has been thorough," said he by way of greeting. "I will give him that much, Watson. When the evidence obliges him, he is thorough." He handed me one of the sheets, a summary of the inspector's preliminary report, which Holmes had obtained by what means I did not inquire. I settled into my chair and read, while Holmes resumed his position at the window. The report was, as Holmes had suggested, not without substance. Lestrade had moved quickly. By the previous evening he had established 3 points which, taken together, constructed a case against Edwin Lyle that most men of legal experience would have considered serviceable, if not yet conclusive. The first concerned Lyle's movements. A night watchman employed by the building, one Thomas Grubb, a reliable witness of some 12 years' service, had observed a young man answering Lyle's description in the corridor outside Armitage's chambers at approximately 10 minutes past 9 on the evening in question. This was more than an hour after Armitage had left, and the building was, by custom, all but deserted. Grubb had not spoken to the young man, as he had taken him at the time to be a late-working clerk, a common enough occurrence. It was only when Lestrade had shown him a photograph of Lyle that Grubb had identified him with confidence. The second point concerned Lyle's lodgings in Kennington. Lestrade had obtained a warrant and searched the rooms that morning, acting with a speed that surprised me and apparently Holmes as well, though he concealed it. In the grate of Lyle's sitting room, among the cold ash of a recently extinguished fire, fragments of burned paper had been recovered. They were small, no piece larger than a playing card, but one bore, in the upper corner, a fragment of text consistent with legal transcription, a half-preserved line of testimony, and below it a certification stamp, partially destroyed, but recognisable. The third point was Lyle himself. When Lestrade had called upon the clerk that morning, he had found him in a state of considerable agitation. His account of his movements on the previous evening was, by Lestrade's careful reckoning, inconsistent in 2 particulars. He claimed initially to have gone directly home from the chambers at 6:30, and yet a shopkeeper in the Strand had recalled serving him at shortly after 8, a detail Lyle, when confronted, had amended to include a walk he had somehow neglected to mention. I set down the report. "It appears, on the face of it, a strong case." "On the face of it," Holmes agreed, without turning from the window. "You do not share Lestrade's confidence." "I share his facts. His interpretation is another matter." He turned at last, and I saw in his expression that quality of restrained intellectual dissatisfaction which preceded, in my experience, some of his most illuminating observations. But let us not be premature. There is considerable value in allowing a theory to present its strongest arguments before one undertakes to challenge it. We met Lestrade that afternoon at the offices of Scotland Yard. The inspector received us in his customary manner, warmly enough toward me, and with Holmes that particular mixture of professional respect and personal wariness which their long acquaintance had produced. He was a compact, dark-eyed man of energetic disposition, and he wore the expression of a detective who considers a case as good as closed. "Mr. Holmes," said he, leaning back in his chair with the measured satisfaction of a man who has earned his comfort, "I think we have our man. It remains only to obtain the confession, and I expect that will come once Lyle understands the weight of evidence against him." "Walk me through it," said Holmes pleasantly. Lestrade did so, elaborating upon each point of his report with considerable professional pride. The watchman's identification was solid. The burned fragments had been examined by a specialist in document evidence, who confirmed the partial certification stamp as consistent with the Court of Queen's Bench's standard form. The inconsistency in Lyle's account of his evening he attributed, without excessive charity, to the evasions of a guilty man attempting to construct a plausible narrative after the fact. And the motive, Holmes asked? Clear as daylight. Lyle was passed over for promotion last month, formally reprimanded by Armitage in front of the other clerks, which is a humiliation a proud young man doesn't forget easily. He had access, he had grievance, and he had the means. When a man wants to wound his employer and protect himself financially, perhaps by selling the document, the combination is a common enough road to crime. Holmes nodded slowly. You mentioned that Lyle was seen in the corridor at 9:09. Had the other clerks departed by that hour? All confirmed gone by 6:30. And the lock on Armitage's desk. No signs of forced entry, which tells us Lyle had a copy of the key, or that Armitage's security was rather less rigorous than he represents. Or, said Holmes mildly, something else entirely. He rose before Lestrade could respond. Thank you, Inspector. You have been, as always, admirably precise. In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes was quiet for some minutes, watching the streets with an unfocused gaze that I recognised as concentrated thought rather than inattention. The burned fragments trouble you, I ventured. They trouble me considerably, Watson. A man who commits theft for profit does not destroy the article upon the same night. It contradicts the motive. If Lyle took the transcript to sell it, and Lestrade implies as much, why burn it within hours of the theft? And if he burned it in a panic, having lost his nerve, why carry it all the way to Kennington, rather than destroying it closer at hand, or indeed within the chambers themselves? Perhaps he changed his mind. Perhaps. Or perhaps the fragments in that grate were placed there by someone who understood that investigators look for exactly such evidence. He tapped his finger once upon the window pane. Lestrade has built a sound structure, Watson. The difficulty is that a sound structure erected upon a flawed foundation does not stand. It merely falls with greater conviction. I considered this in silence as we crossed the river, the afternoon light dyeing copper behind the rooftops. There was, I reflected, something almost melancholy in the position of Edwin Lyle, a young man whose professional misfortune had made him, in the eyes of the law, exactly the shape of suspect that the crime required. Whether that coincidence was natural or manufactured remained for the present Holmes's central question. By the time we reached Baker Street, Holmes had retreated entirely into himself. He ate nothing at dinner, spoke only to request that I hand him his pipe, and spent the remainder of the evening cross-legged in his chair with his eyes half closed, and the expression of a man conducting a rigorous interior argument. I left him to it, as I had learned long ago was wisest. When Sherlock Holmes went inward in that particular way, it meant that the surface of the case had ceased to interest him, and that he was engaged now with what lay beneath. That, in my experience, was when the real work began. Chapter 3. Holmes. Questions the obvious. There are moments in an investigation when the facts, however compelling in their arrangement, begin to emit a faint but unmistakable dissonance, the way a well-tuned instrument will betray to a sensitive ear the single string that has slipped. Holmes had heard that dissonance the previous evening. I had seen it in his stillness. By Thursday morning he was ready to act upon it. He announced at breakfast, with the abruptness that was habitual to him when a matter had resolved itself overnight into a plan, that we were to return to Armitage's chambers. Not to interview anyone, he was careful to specify, but to look. The distinction, in Holmes's practice, was absolute. Armitage received us with visible gratitude, though he carried himself with the somewhat diminished authority of a man whose professional standing is contingent upon the resolution of a crisis not yet resolved. He offered Holmes unrestricted access to the chambers, and posted himself near the door with the slightly anxious manner of a host who suspects his premises of concealing something unflattering. Holmes paid him no particular attention. He entered the inner office, set his hat and coat upon the chair nearest the door, and stood for a full minute in the centre of the room without moving or speaking, his gaze travelling slowly from the desk to the window, to the shelves and back again. I had witnessed this preliminary survey before, and I knew better than to interrupt it. To an observer unacquainted with his methods, it would have appeared that Holmes was doing nothing of substance. In reality, he was allowing the room to speak before he began asking questions of it. "The light enters from the southwest," he murmured, more to himself than to either of us. Afternoon light would fall directly upon the desk surface. The leather shows no significant fading on the left-hand side, which suggests the drawer in question has been shaded for a considerable period. Book stack there, perhaps, or a document case. "Armitage, do you habitually keep anything upon the left pedestal?" Armitage looked momentarily surprised by the precision of the question. "A deed box, generally. I removed it last week in order to access some older files." "Last week," Holmes repeated softly. He knelt once more before the lower left-hand drawer, producing his lens, and examined the lock with an attention that extended for some time to the wood immediately surrounding it, the brass escutcheon, and the narrow gap between the drawer face and the pedestal frame. Then he rose, moved to the window, and examined the latch and frame with equal patience. I watched Armitage during this interval. The barrister was a disciplined man, and he maintained an expression of courteous attentiveness, but beneath it I detected something I could not at once classify, not quite anxiety and not quite impatience. A watchfulness, perhaps, of a particular and guarded quality. Holmes straightened from the window and turned. "Inspector Lestrade informs me that there are no signs of forced entry upon the lock." "That is correct. The lock is a Bramah mechanism, an excellent choice, and not easily defeated by crude means. Has a second key ever been cut?" "Never. The original is the only key in existence, to my knowledge." "To your knowledge," Holmes said. He did not pursue the qualification, but moved instead to the grate on the far side of the room, where he crouched and examined the interior with the lens. The grate had evidently been cleaned recently, the ash removed, the iron brushed, and after a moment he rose and dusted his knees with his characteristic briskness. "Tell me," said he, addressing Armitage in a tone of mild professional curiosity, "when the chambers were last used for the burning of documents." Armitage frowned. "I occasionally destroyed drafts and superseded briefs. As recently as Monday, I believe. Routine materials, nothing of significance." "Monday. And the certified transcript was lodged here when?" "Tuesday afternoon." "Upon its return from the court officer's rooms." So the grate was cleaned subsequent to the last burning, but prior to the transcript's arrival. Holmes nodded once, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "And Lyle would have been present on Tuesday." "He was. He received the transcript from the court messenger and placed it in the drawer himself at my instruction." Holmes said nothing further about the grate, but I noticed that he returned to it once more before we left the room, this time examining not the interior but the outer edge of the iron surround, and the small margin of hearthstone immediately before it. Whatever he found or failed to find, he kept to himself. We spent another quarter of an hour in the chambers. Holmes examined the surfaces of the bookshelves with the lens, then paid close attention to a small mahogany side table that stood beside the door, and at one point lay almost flat upon the carpet near the desk, peering at the nap with an expression of concentrated inquiry that Armitage observed with barely concealed bewilderment. I confess that even to me, who knew Holmes as well as any man living, the significance of several of these examinations was not immediately apparent. Holmes operated in the field with the self-sufficiency of a man who carries his conclusions internally and releases them only when they are fully formed. It was, I had long since accepted, both the most instructive and the most frustrating aspect of his method. As we descended to the street, I put the question directly. "Well, Holmes, are you satisfied?" He walked several paces before answering. "I'm satisfied that the room has told me a great deal. Whether it has told me everything I require is another question." "And the lock? You examined it at length." "There is no evidence of picking, no evidence of a duplicate key having been used, and no evidence of the drawer having been forced." He paused at the curb and raised his stick for a cab. which is precisely what one would expect to find if the drawer had been opened with the original key by the person who habitually carries it. I turned this over carefully. You mean Armitage himself? I mean that possibility has not yet been eliminated, said Holmes, with the precision he always brought to bear when I was inclined to leap ahead of the evidence. Eliminate the impossible, Watson. What remains, however uncomfortable, requires consideration. The cab arrived. And as we settled into it, Holmes resumed in a lower register, as though thinking aloud rather than addressing me directly. There is one further matter. The ash in that grate, Watson. Lestrade has built considerable weight upon the fragments recovered from Lyle's lodging. Quite rightly they are suggestive, but he has given no corresponding attention to what was burned in Armitage's own grate on Monday, the day before the Transcript arrived. You think it relevant? I think it unexplored. There is a difference. He looked out at the passing street. A man who burns routine drafts routinely leaves a particular quality of residue. The remnants of typed or handwritten sheets, the occasional fragment of an envelope. What I observed in that grate this morning was a finer, more thorough ash than routine burning typically produces. Someone was careful. The cab bore us northward through the lunch-hour streets. I sat with Holmes's observation turning in my mind, aware that he had reached some junction in his reasoning that I could not yet fully map. The official case against Lyle was coherent and not without force, and yet sitting beside Holmes in that rattling cab, watching the familiar furrow of concentration between his brows, I found my own certainty in Lyle's guilt beginning, quietly and without fanfare, to loosen. Holmes had not accused anyone. He had raised no dramatic challenge to Lestrade's conclusions. He had done nothing, in fact, but look, carefully, methodically, and with that penetrating patience which was, I had always believed, the truest expression of his genius. Sometimes I reflected, the most consequential thing a man can do in a room is simply refuse to see only what he expects to find. Chapter 4. Reinforcing Appearances. It is a peculiarity of criminal investigations, one which Holmes had remarked upon more than once during our long association, that evidence has a tendency to accumulate in the direction of the first strong suspicion. Whether this reflects a genuine pattern in human behaviour, or merely the selective attentiveness of investigators who have already formed a conclusion, he professed himself unable to say with certainty. What he did say, with characteristic dryness, was that the second possibility was by far the more common. I was reminded of this observation the following morning, when Lestrade appeared at Baker Street before the breakfast things had been cleared. I'm carrying with him that particular expression of a man whose theory has just received a further endorsement from Providence. Holmes was at the mantelpiece, conducting some experiment upon a small square of paper with what appeared to be a weak solution of silver nitrate. He did not look up at Lestrade's entrance, though he tilted his head slightly in acknowledgment of footsteps he would have recognised anywhere. "More evidence, Inspector?" said he. Lestrade settled himself in my vacated chair with the unself-conscious ease of a man who has made himself welcome in a room whether or not the room has invited him. "Considerably more," said he. "I thought you'd want to hear it directly." He had spent the previous afternoon taking additional statements from those who worked in the building. Among the persons interviewed was a senior clerk from the chambers on the floor above Armitage's, a Mr. Alfred Cosgrove, who had been working late on the Tuesday evening in question. Cosgrove had heard footsteps in the corridor below at approximately 9:30. Unhurried footsteps, he specified, which had paused outside what he believed to be Armitage's door before continuing toward the stair. He had thought nothing of it at the time. When Lestrade had shown him the photograph of Lyle, Cosgrove had said, with the measured confidence of a careful man, that he could not be entirely certain, but that the build and bearing were consistent with the young clerk as he had observed him on previous occasions. A second witness placing Lyle on the premises, I remarked. At precisely the relevant hour, Lestrade confirmed, and he then produced a small notebook and consulted it with the gravity of a man delivering a prepared address. The second development concerned Lyle's financial circumstances. Inquiries at the young clerk's bank, conducted, I gathered, with somewhat liberal interpretations of Lestrade's warrant, had revealed that Lyle had inquired 2 weeks previously about the process of transferring a sum abroad. The amount discussed had been vague, the bank clerk recalled, but the inquiry had been specific enough to suggest that Lyle had anticipated receiving money he did not presently possess. Holmes set down his piece of paper and turned at last. How far in advance of the theft was this inquiry made? A fortnight, give or take. Premeditation, then, rather than impulse. Exactly what it suggests. Lestrade allowed himself a small, contained expression of satisfaction. He was passed over for promotion, humiliated in front of colleagues, and began planning his revenge and his profit within days. The transcript was his opportunity, and he took it. Holmes crossed to his chair and sat, drawing his legs up beneath him in that angular fashion which always put me in mind of a large and ruminative bird. You have shown commendable industry, Lestrade. Tell me, in your interview with Lyle, did you inquire specifically about the Tuesday evening in its entirety, or only about his whereabouts at the hours already in question? Lestrade paused fractionally. The substance of the interview concerned his movements between 6 in the evening and midnight, and before 6. He left the chambers at his usual hour of 5:30. He says, Armitage confirms that Lyle received the transcript from the court messenger on Tuesday afternoon and placed it in the drawer himself. Did you establish what time that transaction occurred? Armitage said mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock. So there is a period of approximately 2.5 hours during which Lyle had handled the transcript, was present in the chambers with Armitage presumably still in attendance, and then departed at his habitual time. Holmes pressed his fingers together. A man planning a theft who has already been in contact with the object of that theft and departs without taking it suggests either admirable patience or the absence of prior intention. Lestrade's expression shifted toward the politely combative. Or he was waiting for a safer hour. Quite possibly. Holmes said it with entire equanimity, which I knew to mean that he was reserving his objection for a more strategic moment. What of the motive's broader dimension? The transcript implicated a financier of some standing, I understand. Holloway, Vincent Holloway, the man on trial. He has connections. Lestrade said the final word with a slight but perceptible darkening of tone, the word carrying all the professional weight that a Scotland Yard inspector could invest in the oblique acknowledgement of obstructive social influence. There are those with an interest in seeing the prosecution fail, and Lyle might have been acting on behalf of such interests. It would account for the bank inquiry, payment anticipated, not yet received. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Outside, a brewer's dray passed heavily along the street, its iron wheels loud upon the stones. When Holmes spoke again, it was in a tone of such deliberate mildness that I alone, I think, would have detected the precision underneath it. There is one detail I should like you to verify, Lestrade, before the case is placed before a magistrate. The timing of the alleged burning at Lyle's lodgings. You established that the fire was lit that same Tuesday evening. His landlady heard him in the sitting room before 11. The grate was cold and newly ashed when we searched the following morning. Cold and newly ashed, Holmes repeated. A fire lit before 11 and cold by the following morning suggest it was not maintained. A single burning, then? Brief and purposeful, he paused. For a man disposing of a document of considerable legal and commercial value, the urgency seems remarkable. He steals the transcript with the apparent intention of selling it, and yet burns it within hours of the theft, before any transaction could conceivably have been arranged. Lestrade had the grace to look momentarily uncertain. Men panic. They do, Holmes agreed affably. They also, upon occasion, are made to appear as though they have. He offered nothing further, and Lestrade, after a brief and slightly discomfited pause, took his leave with the manner of a man who has received an observation he intends to disregard on grounds of professional efficiency. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes. You're allowing the case against Lyle to continue building. I am observing it build, Holmes corrected. Rising and returning to his experiment at the mantelpiece. There is an important distinction. Each new piece of evidence that confirms Lyle's guilt is, to my mind, equally a piece of evidence that someone wishes us to believe in Lyle's guilt. The architecture is too regular, Watson. Real guilt produces ragged evidence. This case produces tidy evidence. Each piece arriving at the convenient moment, each one reinforcing rather than complicating the narrative. He held his square of paper to the window light. Lyle's bank inquiry is the most interesting development of the morning, not because it implicates him, but because of its timing, 2 weeks before the theft, which means that if someone was constructing the circumstances of his guilt, approaching him perhaps with propositions that were declined, or feeding information to investigators through channels that have the appearance of independent discovery, they would have required a knowledge of his financial discussions. He set the paper down. Banks are not, as a rule, forthcoming with such information, and yet Lestrade obtained it with admirable ease. I sat with this for a moment. You think someone smoothed the path of the investigation. Holmes turned from the window with that expression I had come to regard as his closest approach to satisfaction. Not pleasure precisely, but the particular composure of a man who has located the thread he means to pull. I think, said he, that it is time we spoke directly with Edwin Lyle. Chapter 5. Language and Evasion. Edwin Lyle was lodging in Kennington, in one of those long terraces of respectable working-class houses that line the streets south of the river with an air of determined but fading propriety. The houses were uniform in their brick fronts and narrow gardens, their differences expressed only in the condition of the paintwork and the cleanliness of the step, details which, as Holmes once observed to me, communicate a great deal about the self-regard of those within. Lyle's landlady, a stout and watchful widow named Mrs. Pierce, admitted us with the cautious civility of a woman who had already received one set of official visitors that week, and was not entirely certain whether this second set constituted an improvement. Holmes presented himself with the relaxed authority he invariably assumed when it suited him, and within 2 minutes we were seated in the narrow parlour, and Lyle had been summoned from his room above. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, and I studied him with the attention that years of observation alongside Holmes had taught me to apply to a first impression. He was younger than I had imagined from the reports. Not yet 30, I judged, with a lean, angular face, and the careful, slightly formal bearing of a man who has educated himself into a profession, and is acutely conscious of the distance he has travelled to get there. His eyes were intelligent and at present wary. He had the look of a man who has been frightened and has resolved not to show it, which produces a particular quality of stillness that is not quite composure. "Mr. Lyle," said Holmes pleasantly, "I am not here in any official capacity. And nothing you say to me will be conveyed to Inspector Lestrade without your consent. I mention this not to invite confidences, but simply to establish the character of our conversation. I should like to ask you some questions. You're entirely free to decline to answer any of them." Lyle sat, folded his hands on his knees and said, "Very well, Mr. Holmes." What followed was one of the more instructive interviews I have witnessed in the course of my association with Holmes, instructive less for its revelations than for the method it displayed. Holmes did not proceed as Lestrade had proceeded. He did not catalogue the evidence and invite Lyle to refute it. He began instead with questions of a routine and almost tediously specific character. The transcript's physical dimensions, the weight of the paper on which it was printed, the colour of the ribbon on the court officer's seal. Lyle answered these questions with precise confidence, and as he did so I watched his posture gradually lose its initial rigidity. He was on safe ground, and he knew it. Then Holmes asked, with no change of tone whatsoever, "When you placed the transcript in Mr. Armitage's drawer on Tuesday afternoon, did you observe any other document already in the drawer?" Lyle considered. "There were some older papers. Briefs, I believe. I did not examine them. And the transcript itself, did you read any portion of it?" "I am not in the habit of reading documents entrusted to me for filing." "Quite so. You are also not in the habit, I take it." of burning papers in your sitting room grate on a Tuesday evening. The transition was so smooth that Lyle had answered before he had fully registered the shift in territory. I burned some correspondence. Personal letters I no longer wish to keep. Personal letters, Holmes repeated. From whom? A brief hesitation. The first. From a former employer. The relationship ended badly, and I preferred not to retain the correspondence. I see. And the inquiry you made at your bank a fortnight ago, the inquiry concerning a transfer of funds, that too was of a personal nature? Lyle's jaw tightened perceptibly. I was considering an investment. It came to nothing. An investment requiring foreign transfer, Holmes said, in the tone of a man filing away a fact without comment. Tell me, Mr. Lyle, do you deny having taken the transcript from Mr. Armitage's chambers? I do deny it, absolutely and completely. Do you deny having destroyed it? I deny it entirely. Holmes paused, and in that pause I caught what I had been listening for. The particular inflection of a man who has been very careful about something. You have denied taking the transcript and you have denied destroying it, Holmes said. You have not denied having it in your possession. The silence that followed was brief but perfectly legible. Lyle's eyes met Holmes's with an expression I could only describe as the look of a man who has just understood the nature of the trap, and whether through intelligence or innocence, has decided to step directly into it rather than around it. I do not have it, said Lyle. I have never had it. I did not take it from those chambers, and I do not know where it is. Holmes studied him for a moment without expression. Then he said, with a gentleness that surprised even me, I believe you, Mr. Lyle. I would ask only that you remain available, and that if anything occurs to you, however apparently irrelevant, you send word to Baker Street. We took our leave of Mrs. Pearce and walked for some distance in silence along the Kennington Road before Holmes spoke. The afternoon was mild for the season, the sky a pale and non-committal grey, and the street traffic thinned as we moved away from the main thoroughfare. He is concealing something, I said. The hesitation over the letters was apparent. He is concealing something, Holmes agreed, but not the theft. A guilty man, Watson. Denies the specific act with excessive elaboration. He anticipates the question and has prepared his refusal. Lyle's denial was unelaborated and direct. His evasions concerned peripheral matters. The letters, the bank inquiry. He's protecting something adjacent to the crime, not the crime itself. What then? That I cannot yet say. But observe the structure of his language throughout. He was precise and unguarded on every matter touching the transcript's physical handling. A man with nothing to conceal there. His caution appeared only when the conversation moved toward his private affairs, the letters, the bank inquiry, his movements on the Tuesday evening. These are the territories he is defending. Holmes turned up his collar against a freshening wind. Which suggests that those territories contain something he considers damaging, whether or not it is relevant to the theft. I turned this over as we walked. You said you believed him. I do believe him, on the central question. That does not preclude his having information he is withholding, whether from misguided self-protection or from a more calculated assessment of his situation. We hailed a cab at the next corner, and as it bore us northward toward the river, Holmes sat in an attitude of quiet reflection that I had learned not to disturb. It was only as we crossed the bridge, the Thames lying broad and leaden below us, that he spoke again, and what he said was not about Lyle at all. This afternoon, said he, I should like to call upon Mr. Armitage once more, not to examine the chambers, but to speak with the man himself. There are one or two aspects of his account that have been troubling me since our first meeting, and I find I'm no longer content to let them rest. What aspects? Holmes turned from the window. The way he describes the transcript's importance. The way a man speaks about a document he has not seen for several days is quite different from the way he speaks about one whose contents are vivid in his mind. Armitage's descriptions have been, throughout, rather too vivid, rather too specific. He paused. And there was one moment, early in our first conversation, when his language shifted in a manner I have been considering ever since. He described what the transcript contained with the confidence of recent familiarity, and then, in the very next sentence, reminded us that he had not laid eyes on it since its disappearance. The cab rattled on. I said nothing because there was, for the moment, nothing useful to say. Holmes had found his second thread, and I could see, from the set of his expression, that he intended to pull it. Chapter 6. The Convenient Narrative. Percival Armitage received us that same afternoon in his chambers, with the composed courtesy of a man who has decided that composure is his best remaining asset. He had exchanged the agitation of our first meeting for something more settled, a deliberate calm, I thought, rather than a natural one. The difference is visible to anyone who has spent sufficient time in the company of people managing difficult truths, and I had spent a great deal of such time in the course of my association with Holmes. Tea was brought and declined. Holmes took the chair directly across from Armitage's desk, a placement I recognised as intentional. It allowed him to observe the barrister's face in the full light from the southwest window without appearing to study it. "I am grateful for your time," Holmes began, in a tone of easy collegiality. "The matter is progressing, and I find myself with some questions of a clarificatory nature. You will forgive me if they seem, in places, to retrace ground already covered." Armitage inclined his head. "By all means." "The transcript," Holmes said. "The Crane testimony. It has been described in general terms as critical to the prosecution's case. I wonder whether you might elaborate upon the specific nature of its importance. Not the legal technicalities, but the substance. What precisely did Crane testify to that could not be reconstructed from other sources?" Armitage settled back slightly. Crane was the accountant engaged by Holloway's firm. He had access to both sets of ledgers, the books presented to investors, and the internal records. His testimony established in specific detail the discrepancy between the two. Without the certified transcript, we cannot reliably introduce those specifics at the submission stage. "Cannot reliably," Holmes repeated, "but the testimony was given in open court. Journalists were present. Court officials heard it." "The certified transcript carries a legal authority that secondary accounts do not. Holloway's defence would challenge any reconstruction of testimony not formally attested." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the financier himself, Vincent Holloway. How long has the prosecution been building its case against him?" 14 months. A substantial investment of effort. The loss of the transcript would be, therefore, not merely a procedural inconvenience, but a significant professional setback for you personally. Something moved behind Armitage's eyes, a brief controlled flicker. "It would be a setback for justice, Mr. Holmes. That is my primary concern." "Of course." Holmes's tone remained entirely pleasant. "I raise it only because I am trying to understand the full dimension of what was lost. A man's motives for an action are often illuminated by the consequences that action was designed to produce." He paused. "Or to prevent." The air in the room changed in a way I felt rather than observed, some subtle alteration in its quality, as though a window had been opened somewhere out of sight. Armitage maintained his expression of attentive cooperation, but his right hand, which had been resting open upon the desk, closed very slightly. "You had reviewed the transcript thoroughly before its disappearance, I take it," Holmes continued, without altering his pace, "given its importance to the case." "I had read it on the day of its return from the court officer, yes." "And you found it entirely satisfactory? No discrepancies? No passages that gave you concern?" A fractional hesitation. "It was consistent with my recollection of Crane's testimony." "Consistent with your recollection," Holmes said. He repeated the phrase with the same mild intonation he had used throughout, and yet somehow the repetition gave it an entirely different weight. "There is one passage, understand, in which Crane was challenged on the dates of certain ledger entries, a challenge that, if I have read the court reports correctly, was not entirely resolved before the session closed." Armitage blinked. Crane's evidence was robust on that point. "Was it?" The reporter from the Daily Chronicle noted some confusion. The defence pressed him on the period between March and June of last year, and the session transcript of that exchange would either confirm or complicate the prosecution's position. Holmes tilted his head with the air of a man pursuing a perfectly natural train of thought. "I imagine you paid particular attention to that portion." There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, which in the context of a conversation that had been moving with polished fluency represented a considerable interruption. Armitage said, "The passage was clear. Crane's evidence on that period was unambiguous." "Remarkable," said Holmes pleasantly, "given that you told Inspector Lestrade on Wednesday that you had not, to your knowledge, reviewed that section in any detail before the transcript's disappearance." I kept my gaze upon Armitage as Holmes spoke, and what I observed in the barrister's face during that moment was not guilt, or not guilt alone, but something closer to the expression of a chess player who has just recognised 3 moves too late that his position is irretrievable. It lasted only an instant before his professional training reasserted itself. "I may have been imprecise in my statement to Lestrade," he said evenly. "I reviewed the transcript in its entirety. That is what I should have said." "Naturally," said Holmes, and with a smile of such amiable understanding that I almost pitied Armitage for what it concealed. "One more matter, and then I shall leave you in peace. The financier Holloway, he has, as Lestrade observed, connections. Did you at any point receive any communication, formal or informal, suggesting that the Holloway prosecution would be better discontinued?" Armitage's response was immediate and appeared unfeigned. "Never. I would have reported any such approach at once." "You would," said Holmes, nodding. "I don't doubt it. A man of your standing could not afford otherwise." He rose, and his movement was so smooth and unhurried that it seemed to close the interview without having confronted it, a sleight of conversational hand that I had seen him perform before to great effect. "Thank you, Armitage. You have been most helpful." We were in the corridor before I trusted myself to speak, and even then I kept my voice low, the building's stone walls having a carrying quality that discouraged confidence. "He knows you're suspicious of him." "He has known since at least yesterday," Holmes said, descending the stairs with his usual long stride. "What interests me now is not whether he suspects my suspicions, but what he does in response to them." He pushed open the outer door and stood for a moment in the pale afternoon air. A man who has nothing to hide becomes more forthcoming when he realises he is under scrutiny. A man with something to conceal becomes more careful. Watch which path Armitage chooses over the next 24 hours. As we walked, Holmes outlined what his further inquiries had established, and he had that morning sent a series of telegrams to the court reporter who had covered the Holloway trial, to a contact within the legal publishing trade, and to a solicitor of his acquaintance whose knowledge of barristerial practice was, Holmes said, encyclopedic. The replies, received before our departure for Kennington, had supplied a detail that he had not yet shared with me. The transcript, it emerged, had not been the only copy in legal existence. A secondary set of notes taken by a junior court official and not yet formalised was held in the officers' rooms. It was incomplete, Holmes emphasised, lacking the certifications and cross-references of Armitage's copy, but it existed, and it contained, in the contested March to June passage, a record of Crane's testimony that differed in one significant particular from the account Armitage had given in his statement to the police. I stopped walking. Differed how? Holmes turned to face me, and the expression he wore was one I associated with the final stages of an investigation. Not triumph, exactly, but the quiet, serious attention of a man who has followed a thread to a place he both expected and regrets to find. "According to the junior official's notes," said Holmes, "Crane's evidence on the March to June ledger entries was not, in fact, unambiguous. He qualified his testimony at 2 points under defence cross-examination, in terms that, if faithfully reproduced in the certified transcript, would have materially weakened the prosecution's position." He paused. "Which gives us, at last, or the thing that has been missing from this case from the beginning, which is?" A reason, said Holmes, for Armitage to want his own transcript to disappear. Chapter 7. The Second Discovery. There is a rhythm to an investigation that experienced detectives learn to read the way a sailor reads the weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small signals that, taken together, indicate a shift in conditions. Holmes had felt that shift the previous afternoon. I had felt it in the changed atmosphere of Armitage's chambers and in the weight of Holmes's final words on the pavement outside. By Friday morning, the investigation had entered a new register entirely. Holmes was at his desk when I arrived, surrounded by the organised disorder that characterised his working periods. Papers in overlapping strata, a street map of the district around the Inns of Court pinned to the mantelpiece, and 3 telegrams arranged in a precise row beside his coffee cup. He was annotating the margins of what appeared to be a copy of the Holloway trial's published court calendar, and he acknowledged my entrance with a brief upward glance before returning to his work. "Lestrade," he said, by way of opening, "will call upon us before midday. He has new evidence." "You have heard from him?" "I have heard nothing from him, but the pattern of this case has been consistent. A new confirmation of Lyle's guilt arrives at regular intervals, each one precisely when the investigation requires refreshing. We are due for another." He set down his pen. "I have, however, heard from the court reporter. The reply to his telegram received that morning confirmed and extended what the junior official's notes had suggested. The reporter, a Mr. Gerald Foss of 18 years' experience covering the Queen's Bench, recalled the contested passage with professional clarity. Under defence cross-examination, Crane had qualified his identification of the March ledger entries twice, once attributing uncertainty to the poor condition of one document, and once acknowledging that a date he had cited might admit of an alternative reading. Both qualifications had been delivered quietly and had not been seized upon dramatically by the defence, which Foss attributed to the defence counsel's apparent failure to recognise their significance in the moment. But they had been spoken, and they had been transcribed. "In the certified transcript as it stood," said Holmes, "those qualifications would have been reproduced verbatim. A careful reading by defence counsel at the submission stage would have identified them, and Holloway's lawyers would have moved at once to exploit them, which would have unravelled the prosecution's position on the ledger dates. Considerably weakened it at minimum. Armitage has spent 14 months building this case. He would have recognised the danger the moment he read the certified text." Holmes rose and moved to the window. "The question that has occupied me since yesterday evening is one of timing. When precisely did Armitage recognise that the transcript as certified was problematic? Before or after he received it on Tuesday afternoon?" I considered. If before, he had time to plan. If after, he acted quickly. Very quickly in either case, whether the transcript was in his possession for less than 24 hours before its disappearance was reported. He turned from the window, which argues for premeditation rather than panic, unless Armitage is a man of exceptional sang-froid, which on the evidence he may well be. Lestrade arrived, as Holmes had predicted, before noon. He came with the step of a man carrying information he considers decisive, and he was barely through the door before he began. A constable conducting routine morning duties in the vicinity of Lincoln's Inn Fields had discovered, in a public waste bin on the south side of the square, a folded collection of papers that proved upon examination to be a portion of the missing transcript. The recovered pages numbered 7, covering approximately a third of the document's total length. They were damaged at the edges, scorch marks consistent with an attempted burning, but legible throughout their main body. The court certification stamp was present on the final recovered page, partially obscured but identifiable. Lestrade set the recovered pages, now enclosed in a police envelope, upon Holmes's table, with the satisfied care of a man presenting an exhibit. Holmes examined them without touching, bending over the envelope's open flap with his lens, and spending some time upon the scorch marks before straightening. "Where precisely in the bin were they found?" he asked. "Near the bottom, beneath a quantity of newspaper and vegetable matter. The constable found them when the bin was being cleared. So they had been there for at least a day, perhaps longer, beneath subsequent deposits. Holmes tilted his head. Lincoln's Inn Fields is not, I think, immediately proximate to Lyle's lodgings in Kennington. A 20-minute walk, easily within range. It is also, Holmes observed pleasantly, within very easy reach of the Inns of Court. A man leaving his chambers in the evening and choosing to walk rather than take a cab would pass through Lincoln's Inn Fields as a matter of natural routing. He straightened and returned the lens to his pocket. Which pages are missing? Lestrade consulted his notebook. The opening section, pages 1 through 4, and what appears to be a middle portion. The recovered pages are numbered 5 through 9 and 14 through 16. Holmes was still for a moment in a way I had come to recognise. It was not the stillness of a man processing information, but of one who has just received a confirmation he had been expecting and is assessing its full implications. Pages 5 through 9, he repeated, and 14 through 16. What is the subject matter of the recovered section so far as you have established? General procedural preamble and the opening portion of Crane's testimony, the accountancy qualifications and background. Not the cross-examination. The cross-examination would fall in the middle section, the missing pages. Yes, said Holmes softly, it would. Lestrade was watching him with the expression of a man who suspects he's being guided toward a conclusion without being told its direction. You find the recovery significant. I find the absence of certain pages significant, Holmes said. The pages that have been recovered are, in terms of evidential weight, the least consequential portion of the transcript. The contested cross-examination passages, the material most damaging to the prosecution's position, are precisely the pages that have not been found. He looked directly at Lestrade. Consider, Inspector, which portions a man would destroy if he wished to eliminate specific damaging content, and which he would discard if he wished to create the appearance of panicked, indiscriminate destruction. Lestrade was quiet for a moment. You are suggesting the recovery was staged. I am suggesting the possibility deserves examination before formal charges are laid. Holmes's tone was measured, carrying none of the impatience he sometimes permitted himself with the inspector. The evidence we have accumulated presents a coherent narrative of Lyle's guilt. I do not dispute its coherence. What I dispute is the assumption that coherence implies truth. After Lestrade had gone, not entirely persuaded, but, I thought, sufficiently unsettled to move with rather less speed toward a magistrate. Holmes stood for some time before the pinned map, his finger tracing the route between the Inns of Court and Lincoln's Inn Fields, with a series of small, deliberate movements. The recovered pages tell us one thing with certainty, he said at last, without turning. Someone read this transcript with attention and legal intelligence before deciding which portions to retain and which to remove. That argues strongly against the theory of a clerk motivated by grievance and commercial opportunism. Lyle had neither the legal training to identify the significance of the cross-examination passages nor, so far as we can establish, any particular interest in the Holloway prosecution's outcome. He turned from the map, and there was, in his expression, a quality I can only describe as a grave and focused anger. Not the sharp variety, but the deeper sort, directed not at a person, but at the nature of what was being attempted. Someone is using this young man as a screen, Holmes said, and that, Watson, is a species of cruelty that I find rather less tolerable than simple dishonesty. He took his coat from the hook by the door with a decisiveness that signalled the afternoon's work had already been arranged in his mind. Come, said he. There is someone I wish to consult before this case proceeds another day without proper understanding. Chapter 8. Growing Certainty. The person Holmes wished to consult proved to be not, as I had half expected, some specialist in legal procedure or documents, but his brother. Mycroft Holmes occupied, as those familiar with his habits will know, a singular position in the machinery of government whose precise nature defied ordinary description. He was a man of extraordinary mental gifts and almost total physical inertia, moving between his rooms in Pall Mall, the Diogenes Club, and the offices in Whitehall that required his occasional attendance with the reluctant regularity of a planet in a very small orbit. When Sherlock wished to consult the accumulated knowledge of Whitehall, the bar, and half the institutions of the city without conducting 7 separate interviews, Mycroft was, as he had once put it to me, the most efficient route between 2 points. We found him at the Diogenes Club in his customary chair, vast and still as a judicial monument, with an evening paper folded across his knee and the expression of a man engaged in thought of a quality too rarefied for visible expression. He regarded our arrival with the tempered displeasure of a man interrupted in the middle of something important that happens to be invisible. "Sherlock," said he by way of acknowledgment, and then, with the faint inclination of the head that served Mycroft for a bow, "Dr. Watson." Holmes dispensed with preamble in the manner that the brothers shared, conveying the substance of the case in perhaps 4 minutes of precise, economical summary. Mycroft listened without interruption, his grey eyes fixed upon the middle distance, his thick fingers laced upon his considerable frontage. When Holmes had finished, Mycroft was silent for a moment. "Armitage," he said at last, as though the name were a word he was turning over for hidden meaning. "He has been before the bar for 25 years, you say. Took silk 8 years ago. His practice has been largely commercial, with occasional forays into criminal prosecution of the kind that builds reputation rather than income." He paused. "The Holloway case would be, by that reckoning, the largest criminal matter he has led." "Precisely," said Holmes. "And Holloway himself." "The railways investment fraud." Mycroft settled deeper into his chair with the infinitesimal adjustment of a man who does not move unless movement is absolutely warranted. "There have been questions at various levels about the original sources of Holloway's capitalisation. He came from nowhere in particular some 12 years ago, and acquired interest in 3 separate railway ventures within 18 months. The pace suggested either exceptional acumen or exceptional assistance." "Assistance from whom?" Mycroft regarded his brother with an expression of mild reproach. "From the sort of people whose names do not appear in commercial registers. Sleeping partners of a very quiet kind." He paused again. "The prosecution of Holloway has not been universally welcomed in certain quarters. Not because he's liked, he is not, but because a thorough accounting of his affairs would require the examination of arrangements that others would prefer to remain unexamined." Holmes leaned forward slightly. Would Armitage have known this? A senior barrister of his experience and connections. Mycroft's expression conveyed the answer without the indignity of stating it. He would have understood the landscape, yes. Whether that understanding influenced his conduct is precisely the question you're here to ask me, and I cannot answer it from knowledge, only from inference. Inference, then. Mycroft unfolded his hands and refolded them in the reverse configuration, which I had come to recognise as his equivalent of rising from a chair. A man in Armitage's position, discovering that his certified transcript contains testimony which, properly read, damages his own prosecution, the case he has staked 14 months of professional effort upon, faces a difficulty of some delicacy. He cannot alter a certified legal document. He cannot suppress it openly. If the weakness is identified at submission, the defence will exploit it, the prosecution will fail, and Armitage will bear the professional consequences of having built a flawed case. "But if the transcript disappears," Holmes said quietly, "then the prosecution proceeds on the basis of what can be reconstructed from other sources, sources which, as he has pointed out to you, lack the certified authority to be challenged with equal force. The weakness in Crane's testimony remains, yes, but it is buried beneath the uncertainty created by the transcript's loss." Mycroft allowed himself a brief, thin expression that was adjacent to a smile. "It is not a perfect solution, but it is the solution available to a man under pressure, with limited time and a convenient subordinate upon whom suspicion might plausibly rest." Holmes sat back. The ink. He had mentioned this once, briefly, in a remark to me following his second visit to the chambers, and had not returned to it until now. Mycroft raised an eyebrow. "Armitage keeps detailed manuscript notes alongside his formal documents," Holmes explained. Notes made in his own hand, cross-referencing the transcript's pages with his preparation materials. I examined those notes during our second visit, and I observed something that has occupied a corner of my attention since. The ink in Armitage's margin annotations is of a slightly different character from the ink present in the recovered transcript fragments. Different how? I asked. Colour primarily, a difference subtle enough that it would pass unnoticed under ordinary examination, but apparent under magnification. Armitage uses, in his working notes, a blue-black iron gall ink of a quality consistent with his general professional fastidiousness. The annotations on the recovered fragments are rendered in a slightly greener tint, a different formulation, older stock, or a different supplier entirely. Holmes paused. When a man annotates a document, he uses the pen and ink that is ready to hand. The annotations in those recovered fragments were not made by the same pen that Armitage uses daily at that desk. The implications settled upon the room. Mycroft received it with the equanimity of a man for whom surprises have long since been reclassified as data. The fragments were annotated by someone else, I said, or were fabricated to resemble Armitage's annotated working copy, Holmes said, by someone who obtained a sample of his annotation style but had access only to different ink. He stood. The recovered pages were intended to suggest that portions of the genuine transcript had been partially destroyed by a panicking thief, but the person who prepared them did not have access to Armitage's personal ink supply. Mycroft regarded his brother with an expression in which fraternal satisfaction and professional gravity were present in approximately equal measure. "You're saying that Armitage did not merely remove the transcript. He prepared substitute fragments to be discovered." "I am saying the ink strongly suggests it. The fragment that Lestrade's specialist authenticated was authenticated on the basis of paper, print type, and certification stamp, none of which require Armitage's personal ink. The annotations, being handwritten, were the one element that required a material match, and it is precisely there that the fabrication has slipped." We took our leave of Mycroft as the afternoon dissolved into a raw November dusk, the Pall Mall gas lamps igniting one by one along the street. Holmes walked in silence for some distance, and I matched his pace without pressing him. Around us London conducted its evening business with its customary vast indifference, the city's noise a constant neutral register against which the small, precise drama of our investigation seemed both miniature and entirely consequential. "There is one further step," Holmes said at last as we turned northward. "I must return to those chambers one final time. Not for the desk, not for the grate, not for the window, but for the shelves. The law volumes." Armitage removed a transcript. He also, unless I'm very considerably mistaken, retained it. A man of his precision and legal temperament would not destroy the original. It represents both a liability and, in some configuration, he may not yet have determined a potential asset. Holmes turned up his collar. He hid it, and the place where a barrister hides a legal document is, almost invariably, among other legal documents. He said nothing more on the subject that evening. But when we parted at Baker Street and I looked back from the pavement, Holmes was already at his window, the room lit behind him, standing in the attitude of a man who has assembled every piece and is preparing with characteristic patience to lay them down. Chapter 9. The Flaw in Assumption. Holmes sent 3 telegrams the following morning. The first was to Lestrade, requesting his attendance at Armitage's chambers at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The second was to Armitage himself, phrased as a courtesy, an intimation that certain matters pertaining to the case had advanced sufficiently to warrant a final conference, and that his presence would be both welcome and, Holmes delicately implied, advisable. The third telegram he wrote without allowing me to see the address, and dispatched it by a separate messenger before breakfast had been properly concluded. I did not ask about the third. There were moments in Holmes's investigations when his arrangements had a private completeness that invited no interrogation, and this was plainly one of them. The day was cold and still, with a sky the colour of old pewter, and a stillness in the air that London sometimes achieves in late November between one weather system and the next, a held breath almost. We took a cab to the Inns of Court shortly before 2, Holmes sitting with his hands upon his stick and his gaze directed inward rather than at the streets, speaking only once during the journey. "When we're assembled," he said, "I shall ask you to observe Armitage's hands." His hands? A man can school his face through long professional training. The hands are less obedient. He said nothing further. Armitage was already in his chambers when we arrived, standing near the window in the composed attitude he had maintained throughout our acquaintance, though I noticed now that I was looking for it that he had placed himself with his back to the light. It was a small thing, a barrister's instinct perhaps to avoid being read. Lestrade arrived 2 minutes after us, with the slightly compressed expression of a man who suspects he has been summoned to a conclusion he did not himself reach. He stationed himself near the door with the professional neutrality of a policeman who is not yet determined whether he is about to make an arrest or witness an embarrassment. Holmes stood at the centre of the room, unhurried, allowing the assembled weight of the occasion to settle before he began. When he spoke, his voice had the measured clarity he reserved for moments of formal exposition, not theatrical, but precise in the way that a surgical instrument is precise. "I am grateful to you both for coming," he said. "I shall be as direct as the matter permits. We are here because an innocent man stands in danger of prosecution for a crime he did not commit, and because the truth of this affair, if not established clearly and soon, will be obscured by the momentum of a plausible but entirely mistaken official narrative." Lestrade shifted slightly. Armitage was perfectly still. "The central error of this investigation," Holmes continued, "has been an assumption so fundamental that it was never examined. The assumption is this, that the transcript was in the locked drawer on the morning of its reported disappearance, and that its absence therefore constitutes a theft occurring between the previous evening and that morning." He paused. "That assumption is false." Armitage's expression did not change. His hands, which I was watching as Holmes had instructed, tightened fractionally against his sides. Mr. Armitage removed the transcript himself prior to reporting it missing, at some point on Tuesday evening, after his clerk had left the building. He took it not to destroy it, but to conceal it, and to alter or to replace the specific passages which he had identified as damaging to his prosecution. Holmes turned briefly toward Lestrade. "The transcript was never stolen, Inspector. It was removed by its own custodian, and the appearance of theft was constructed after the fact." Lestrade opened his mouth, but Holmes continued without pause. The construction was not crude. It required preparation, nerve, and a thorough knowledge of how criminal investigations are conducted. Suspicion was directed toward Edwin Lyle by means of 3 devices. First, fragments of burned paper were introduced into Lyle's grate. Not the transcript itself, but earlier draft materials, annotated in a hand that could suggest Armitage's working copies. He obtained from his own files and transported to Kennington. Second, Lyle's presence near the chambers was a matter of established routine, known to the night watchman and easily predicted. His already strained relationship with Armitage supplied the motive without any further contrivance being necessary. Third, portions of a fabricated substitute were deposited in the waste bin at Lincoln's Inn Fields, pages drawn from the genuine transcript's opening sections, which were of no evidential significance, combined with the manuscript annotations rendered in ink that does not match the ink Mr. Armitage uses at that desk. Holmes moved to the desk and laid his hand flat upon its surface, with a deliberate gesture that drew the room's attention to it. "The lock on that drawer shows no signs of external interference because there was none. The drawer was opened by the man who possesses the only key. When I examined it on our first visit, the brass escutcheon showed a very faint but consistent pressure mark on the inner face, consistent with a key being turned under slight additional force, the pressure of a man conscious that he is doing something he must not appear to have done, and therefore holding the key with greater tension than habit would produce." Armitage spoke for the first time, and his voice, I will grant him, was almost perfectly steady. "This is an extraordinary series of allegations, Mr. Holmes." "It is an extraordinary series of facts," Holmes replied. "I have not yet arrived at the most extraordinary." He turned to face Armitage directly. "Throughout our conversations, you have described the contents of the certified transcript with a specificity that no man could sustain after several days without access to it. On our first meeting, you referenced the cross-examination passages in terms that indicated detailed recent familiarity. When I raised this with you subsequently, you amended your account, claiming to have reviewed the transcript in its entirety upon its return. Yet in your original statement to Inspector Lestrade, you specified that you had not examined it closely since its delivery." He let the silence carry the weight of that contradiction for a moment. The amendment was itself revealing. A man who had genuinely reviewed the transcript in full would have said so from the beginning. It is not a fact that requires correction. A man who had not reviewed it but needed to explain his familiarity with its contents would introduce that review retrospectively, when pressed. Holmes clasped his hands behind him. "You described a document you had been closely studying. You described it the way a man describes something that is in the room with him, not something that has been out of his possession for days." Armitage's hands had stopped their careful stillness. The left had closed fully. The right was gripping the edge of his jacket with a steadiness that was, paradoxically, the clearest sign of effort. "Furthermore," Holmes said, "the transcript has not been destroyed. A barrister of your formation does not destroy a certified legal document. The professional prohibition against it is too deeply ingrained. You have concealed it, intending either to produce an altered version at the appropriate moment or to retain the original as a form of future insurance. My examination of your shelves during our second visit identified 4 volumes of Blackstone's commentaries on the 3rd shelf from the Flaw, left-hand case. 3 of those volumes have been consulted with some regularity, judging by the wear upon their spines and the slight displacement of their pages. The 4th has not been touched in a considerable time. The dust at its base tells that story plainly. And yet this week it has been moved, replaced slightly out of alignment with its fellows, inserted in fact rather than returned." The room was entirely silent. Lestrade stood with his notebook open, pen arrested above the page, watching Armitage with the calculating attention of a man making real-time adjustments to his professional understanding of the situation. Holmes crossed to the bookcase, withdrew the 4th volume of Blackstone with a single smooth motion, and held it for a moment before opening its cover to reveal, folded within, a sheaf of papers bearing the unmistakable heading of the Court of Queen's Bench and the certification stamp of the court officer's office. "The case against Edwin Lyle," Holmes said, setting the volume and its contents upon the desk with a quietness that rendered the action more final than any dramatic gesture could have achieved, "rests entirely upon evidence manufactured by the man who reported the theft. The transcript was never missing. It was here." He stepped back, and the room received what had just occurred in its several different ways. Lestrade, with the disciplined recalibration of a professional absorbing an unwelcome correction, and Armitage with the stillness of a man upon whom a door has just, irrevocably, closed. Chapter 10. The Restoration of Truth. What followed in those first minutes after Holmes set the transcript upon the desk was not the dramatic collapse I might have anticipated. Armitage did not bluster, did not attempt denial, did not reach for the professional armour of indignation. He stood for a long moment looking at the folded papers with an expression I found difficult to categorise. Not shame, precisely, and not defiance, but something between the two that might, in a more generous light, have been read as the recognition of a man who's been playing a game he always knew he could not ultimately win. Lestrade broke the silence, as Lestrade invariably did on such occasions, by clearing his throat and reaching for the transcript with the deliberate practicality of a man reasserting professional authority over a situation that has briefly exceeded it. He examined the certification stamp, the court header, the pagination, the physical due diligence of an investigator confirming what he already, at some level understood. "Mr. Armitage," said he, in a tone that was formal without being unkind, "I think you had better sit down." Armitage sat, and having sat he seemed in some way to deflate, not dramatically, but in the manner of a structure from which the internal pressure has gradually been released. He placed both hands on the desk before him, palms down, and looked at Holmes with an expression that had finally relinquished its carefully maintained composure. "How long?" he asked, and the question encompassed rather more than it stated. "I suspected the direction of the thing from the first examination of your chambers," Holmes replied, taking the chair across the desk with the matter-of-fact ease of a man settling in for a conversation he has long expected. The lock showed no evidence of external interference. A clerk of Lyle's standing would have had neither the skill nor the means to defeat a Bramah mechanism without trace. The question of how the transcript was removed without force applied itself, in the absence of a duplicate key, inevitably to the person who holds the original. He paused. The ink was the confirmation I needed. The rest was a matter of following the logic where it led. Armitage was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat precision of a man giving a deposition, measured, factual, stripped of the rhetorical refinements that had characterized all his previous speech in these chambers. "I read the transcript on Tuesday evening," he said. "After Lyle had gone. I had intended only a brief review before the following morning, but I saw at once what the cross-examination passages contained. Crane's qualifications, his uncertainty about the March dates, had seemed minor in the courtroom. In the certified text they were precise and explicit. Defense counsel had not fully exploited them in the moment, but a careful reading at submission stage would have given them everything they required to challenge the prosecution's central argument on the ledger discrepancies. He looked down at his hands. 14 months, Mr. Holmes. 14 months of preparation. Holloway has defrauded men of very modest means, clerks, tradespeople, small investors who placed their savings in his ventures on the strength of representations he knew to be false. The justice of the prosecution was not in question, only its sufficiency." "And so you decided to improve its sufficiency," Holmes said, without inflection. "I told myself it was a temporary measure, that I would arrange for the transcript's replacement with a corrected version. Not altered in substance, you understand, but with Crane's qualifications rendered with greater precision, in a form that would more accurately reflect what he had meant to say rather than the imprecise language under cross-examination pressure." Armitage stopped. "I recognize in stating that how it sounds." "It sounds," Holmes said, "like a man who has confused the justice of a cause with the legitimacy of the means employed in its service. It is a confusion that has ruined better men than most." Lestrade, who had been taking notes with the steady application of a man committed to a full record, looked up at this. "And Lyle? Did you select him deliberately, or was his position simply convenient?" Armitage had the decency to look uncomfortable in a way that no professional training could entirely conceal. His situation made him the natural focus of suspicion. I did not engineer his difficulties, those were genuine. But I will not pretend that I was ignorant of how they would be read once the transcript was reported missing. "You placed the burned materials in his grate yourself," Holmes said. "It was not a question. I kept earlier drafts, working copies from the preparation stage, annotated in a manner consistent with my own notes. I went to his lodgings on Tuesday night, while he was out, and arranged the materials in the grate. Mrs. Pierce had gone to her sister for the evening, a circumstance I was aware of." He paused. "The transcript fragments in Lincoln's Inn Fields I placed there on Wednesday morning. I had been listening to this account from my position near the window, and I found in myself a complicated response to Armitage's candour. There was, undeniably, something in his manner that compelled a form of respect, the absence of equivocation, the willingness to state plainly what he had done once the alternative had been removed. And yet the clarity of his account threw into sharper relief, rather than diminished, the nature of what he had attempted, not merely a manipulation of evidence, but the deliberate construction of another man's ruin. Edwin Lyle's face rose in my mind as I had last seen it, the controlled wariness, the intelligent eyes, the particular dignity of a man who has worked hard for a position that is now threatened by forces entirely beyond his making. Holmes appeared to read something of this in my expression, for he glanced briefly in my direction before returning his attention to Armitage. "The third telegram I sent this morning," he said, addressing me rather than the barrister, "was to Lyle himself. He is, at this moment, in a cab on his way to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson has instructions to make him comfortable until we return." Lestrade rose, straightened his coat with the brisk finality of a man moving from one professional phase to the next, and requested that Armitage accompany him. The barrister complied without protest, pausing only to take his hat from the rack near the door in a gesture so habitual and mundane that it struck me, in the circumstances, as quietly heartbreaking. He had occupied these chambers for the better part of 2 decades. The hat had hung on that particular hook for longer, in all probability, than Lyle had been in the profession. At the door, Armitage turned once, not toward Lestrade but toward Holmes, and "I should like to know," he said, with a composure that had about it now something genuinely dignified rather than performed, "whether you considered at any point that I might have been correct, about the justice of it, about Holloway." Holmes regarded him steadily. "I considered it from the beginning," he said. "The justice of a cause is not in dispute. It never was. What is in dispute is whether a man appointed by the law to prosecute in its name may substitute his private judgment for its processes when those processes prove inconvenient. That substitution, Mr. Armitage, is not justice. It is its opposite, however sincerely it is intended." Armitage nodded once as though receiving a verdict he had already pronounced upon himself, and went out with Lestrade into the cold corridor. Holmes and I remained in the emptied chambers for a moment, the silence of the room settling around us with the particular quality of spaces that have recently contained consequential events. The transcript lay on the desk, recovered, intact, its certified pages undamaged, and now, at last, in the proper custody of the investigation that would determine its use. We walked back to Baker Street in the fading afternoon, the early winter dark coming down with its customary November decisiveness. I thought of Edwin Lyle waiting in our sitting room with whatever remained of his composure, and felt something that was not quite relief. Relief would come later, when the formal exoneration had been confirmed, but something preliminary to it, a lightening. Lyle, when we arrived, I was seated upright in my customary chair with a cup of tea growing cold beside him, and the expression of a man who has been uncertain for so long that good news arrives with the quality of something not entirely trusted. Holmes told him plainly and briefly, with none of the ceremony that the moment might have been thought to warrant, and all of the directness that it actually required. The young man received the news with a stillness that gradually, visibly, became a different kind of stillness altogether. Holmes turned to me as I refilled the teapot, and there was in his expression that quiet, watchful satisfaction that served him in place of the emotions a less disciplined man might have permitted himself. "You will write this up, Watson," he said. It was not quite a question. "I shall," said I, "though I am not certain how to end it." Holmes settled into his chair, pressed his fingers together and looked for a moment at the ceiling with the meditative ease of a man entirely at rest with his conclusions. "End it," said he, "with the observation that has been the foundation of the affair from the beginning. It is not the obvious that deceives us. It is the unquestioned. Everything else in this case, the planted evidence, the convenient suspect, the fabricated fragments, rested entirely upon the assumption that no one would think to ask whether the theft had occurred at all. The moment that question was asked, the rest followed as naturally as one domino yields to the next." He reached for his pipe with the unhurried deliberation of a man settling in for the evening. The world presents us daily with narratives that satisfy expectation. The only reliable defence against them is the habit of examining what we have taken as given. Outside, Baker Street went about its evening business in the lamplight. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was moving about with a reassuring domestic purposefulness that was, in its own way, as constant a feature of my life as Holmes himself. Lyle sat quietly with his tea, restored, if not yet entirely believing in his restoration. The case was concluded, and I, who have set down so many of Holmes's cases across so many years, and have never yet found the work anything other than worthwhile, picked up my pen and began.